your chair today. My name is Katie.
And I'm Dominic.
All right, so before we start this round, if I could have each team please tell me who is speaking first. And you can also use this to tell me the pronouns you can use. If not, you totally don't have to. All right, so for opening government, who's speaking first?
Nathan Burns, no preference.
Okay, opening opposition.
Robert, no preference.
Okay, closing gov.
Julia, no preference.
And for closing opposition.
Reese, masculine pronouns.
Okay. All right, without further ado, I will the Prime Minister to kick off this round of speech.
Are you timekeeping yourself?
Do you mind?
No, not at all. I'll just be running a timer.
Okay. The world that my parents and my grandparents grew up in is dead. The world in which you were able to work at one place for 20 years. You were able to retire and get a gold watch at the end of it. That world has long since passed us. That I will never have the certainty of going, oh, this is the job that I'm going to be pursuing for the entire rest of my life. And one of the things that has put that workers' world in which real wages went up and workers were realistically able to invest in long-term wealth, like housing, like education for their children, is gone. And no small part of this owes to the rise of the gig economy and the death of organized labor, two intricately linked things. So, for the model, how we're going to adjudicate this, this is a this House regrets motion, and we'd like to imagine that there's two possible worlds. There's the juncture where the gig economy doesn't take off, and we want you to have regret not living in that world. We'd like to imagine that you would be either the person you are today or just the average person, and you're going to be most likely a worker, and you, because you live in this world today, have far less prospects than you've had in the past. And there's three reasons why this is the case. The first is the vicious power dynamic between companies and contractors. The second is how this power dynamic stops any checks, traditional checks on abuses. And third, how this has led in a sizable decline to the real quality of life experienced by workers. So, starting off, let's examine this power dynamic that occurs between contractors and firms. Because, so ideally, in any sort of capitalist system, you have two equal party members at the table making a mutually beneficial trade, right? This is when two companies decide to sell to one another. And in this, what they've gotten away with, these various companies that have put out these contracts in lieu of, that have put out these various business contracts and encourage their employees to be these sort of self-reliant entities instead of them being employees with specific duties owed to them by the company, that they've said, well, you're free to negotiate it with us freely. You're free to come, you're free to go. But there is an incredible power dynamic at place here, that it is you are David versus Goliath in this specific instance. That while they have a litigation team, while they have the ability to negotiate this contract, and while at the end of the day they don't really need you, right? That you need them, you have rent you have to pay, you have bills you have to meet. They don't need you, they'd like to have you, they'd like to grow, but they'd like to have you at the lowest possible opportunities. The second thing, and this is just a matter of sheer numbers, there are a lot more companies than there are workers, so it is incredibly easier there are a lot less companies than there are workers, so it is fundamentally a seller's marketplace when they're giving away jobs, and they have the incredible ability to seek the absolute lowest consumer, but opening disagrees.
All right, this is a fundamental mischaracterization of the economy. In many cases, like in Airbnb or in Uber, it's a common person having a transaction with another common person, in which case we think they do kind of need the person in the gig economy. They're drunk and they need to get home.
So we think that these, by and large, are not incredibly different than cabbies, right? That the gig economy hasn't fundamentally innovated too much beyond what we have, but what it has done is it's fundamentally stripped away protections that you would otherwise have when you have firms that you're able to follow up with. So let's talk about what the gig economy looks like. So first off, so this power dynamic continues to exist where they have all of the power in the relationship that they're able to freely negotiate, and all the protections traditionally allocated to workers legally are not able to be had by contracts. That whatever the contract is that they have signed, you are bound to, and they can end it whenever they want to, and they have a vested interest in writing exploitative contracts. So let's talk about how this power dynamic turns vicious. The first thing is that we lose the traditional protections offered to employees, right? The HR department, the ability to unionize, that organized labor cannot coexist under a gig economy. That by and large, we've seen the death of unions, and with it the death in real increases in wages. We've seen the death in the ability for people to organize collectively to act for better working conditions, because when you are mere two mere firms negotiating with each other, the last thing you want to do is rock the boat. You are far less likely to follow abuse or indiscretion. We also think that the companies have absolutely no interest to ever invest in you. That by and large, why would you invest in another competitor who can go out freely into the marketplace? That whereas companies used to provide on-the-job training for their employees, whereas they would be interested in keeping and maintaining an employee pool, what you want to do is you want to find the best possible talent for the cheapest possible price and not invest in it at all. This has made employees, by and large, have to follow a series of, this is by and large made employees have to pursue their own capital creation, right? This is where you have to go out, get your own car. That Uber is going to do everything, that you're going to do everything for Uber except for install the app, and they fundamentally get to set your wages and your rates, and you have no possible ability to get this other than going to Lyft, and they act in tandem. That there are precisely two competitors on the marketplace, and there are thousands of people ready to replace you at a moment's notice, and any of your traditional protections are fundamentally gone. So the last I'd like to talk about is how this has fundamentally lowered quality of life for workers. That what we start to see is that we've seen that because there is no investment in the workplace, that there is very little improvement to invest in these specific people who can leave you at any point. We think that there is that by and large, we pushed the vast majority of this either capital creation or this capital gaining or this education gaining entirely on the employee. And the second thing that we think is that this is, by and large, led to a really long-term lack of certainty, that there is no real knowledge about what you are going to be doing years from now. And the answer is always, well, get another job, run some side hustle. But we think that this level of certainty is insufficient, right? To where you don't know what your retirement plan is going to be looking like. You don't know where your health care might be coming from this month. You do not know if you are capable of signing a 25-year mortgage that will allow you to elevate yourself and your children from the middle class to the upper class, or from poverty towards the middle class. That fundamentally you live forever in uncertainty. There's a reason why markets like certainty as much as they do, because it allows for you to make long-term, sizable decisions to create wealth. That there is no get-rich-quick schemes, and all of the get-rich-quick schemes that have replaced traditional employment are regrettable, and it is in a world in which we prefer not to live. So, we fundamentally think that for a handful of reasons, we think that the power dynamic that exists between the contractors and the companies is terrifying, and we think that it is fundamentally prone to abuse, that we see multiple times in this, and that these abuses and the lack of checks on it have fundamentally lowered the quality of life for the American worker. That this is not the world that we wanted. It is a world we would not prefer. It is a world we regret. Proud to propose.
I think there are two different comparatives in this debate that is going to give opening opposition the win. The first is engaging Nathan on the material that he delivered, which is to say that on the comparative, we think that workers have far more flexibility in the gig economy, one where they're not shackled to employers who do not care about them, employers who exploit them, employers who discriminate against them. That's going to result in a better world for workers and consumers. The second world we're going to win is the part in the debate that is extremely neglected by the Prime Minister, and that is the fact that this is the difference between people who have long-term jobs in the kind of economy that Nathan prefers, and people who do not have jobs at all and need the gig economy just to survive, just to get by, just to pay their bills and make sure they have health care. Let's begin. First, why is this better for workers and consumers on the comparative? What's wrong with the status quo that Nathan outlined? three different problems, right? The first is that individuals, specifically workers, have little flexibility to decide the terms of their employment. That is to say, they don't get to decide so much their hours. They don't get to decide where they are located. They have to commute to jobs that they hate, spend 8 hours or 9 hours a day. They're coerced by their employers to commit into unpaid hours in labor that they otherwise would like to get paid for. They're forced to spend resources that they otherwise wouldn't want to spend them on, i.e. teachers who spend lots of time and money grading and making sure people have the sorts of materials they need for their students to succeed. They have no leverage against their employer in formal lawsuits in instances where their employer abuses them if you are a member of a minority or a marginalized group. In many particular instances, even when there is employer employment legislation in place to try and protect those individuals. 2, the power dynamics are far worse on their side of the house. That is because of things like at-will firing that say that in times of either economic crisis or when a company is quote-unquote strapped for money, i.e. they just want to get rid of some people to bring in some people that they would otherwise rather hire, it's very easy to just shove people away. Those people are often coerced into signing on to those at-will contracts in the very first place. They're also, again, I talked about how they're coerced into lots of unpaid labor. They often experience discrimination against them that cannot be resolved through legal channels, things like abuse, things like bias, things like sexism and racism. Third problem, there is a major problem with monopolization. That is to say that, yes, lots of people want to become taxi drivers, but the problem is that you have to buy a $75,000 medallion in New York just to make sure you can get into the market. It is large tech companies that previously weren't hiring independent contractors and workers and are now turning into large conglomerates to decide the factors that dictate how the market is going to work and long-term trends of growth and productivity, where employees specifically, this is the important part, have no say over the dictation of those terms in the very first place. Why are things better on our side of the house? 4 reasons why, then some engagement with Nathan. First, employment is at your own discretion and on your own terms. I think on the comparative, it's far better when you're able to get employed with a person like a company like Uber and decide when you're going to drive, how you're going to work, if you want to take time off to make sure you can spend time with your kids who you otherwise can't make money to try and spend money on childcare with them. It means that there is less arbitrary firing because yes, Uber does in fact care less about their workers than say a employer that has to make long-term decisions about who they're hiring and spending like training on, but Uber needs those employees to be loyal to that company to make sure they have drivers in the very first place, which means that 1, there is at least some incentive to make sure that they stay on with that company, but 2, it means that employees are far happier because they're able to decide the terms of their own employment. They're able to take up more hours of work for them, which means that flexibility often means that people are happier in their jobs, which means they commit more to the company in the first place, which means you get far more long-term growth and productivity in an economy where people actually care about what they're doing as opposed to traveling 2.5 hours down to Manhattan to a job that they absolutely hate. Second of all, it's less susceptible to monopolization. I suspect somewhere down the bench there's going to be some sort of talk about how this is unregulatable and how people are abused by companies like Uber. 2 things here to say. First of all, we would say that people don't stay in the gig economy forever, right? That is to say that they earn enough money to make sure that they can do things like get an education so that they can get into a long-term job, whereas they don't have that money because they're shut out of long-term employment in the very first place. We'll talk about that later. People will eventually enter long-term employment schemes that actually benefit them in the long term. So this is a short-term job that they get in order to make sure they can get by. Second of all, the flip side of regulation means that it's incredibly difficult to account for companies that collude, companies that abuse their workers with no record and lobby the government to make sure that there are corporate tax incentives and protections for them that protect them from any sort of liability in the long term, which means that we far prefer companies that are better, like treat their workers better, as opposed to colluding and creating large monopolies that are really, really bad for the economy. I'll get you at the end of this point here. Third, and most importantly, convenience. I think this is a huge point in this debate, even though it seems trivial to a lot of individuals. I think Uber Eats driving to your house and delivering you, buying a pizza and delivering it to you, is far better for people's individual happiness than driving it in the middle of town, sitting down at a restaurant, being around a bunch of people that you absolutely hate, not being able to talk to the person that is in front of you and communicate with them on an individual basis, and just being in a consumer society where we are forced to constantly be in places that we do not enjoy and that we do not recollect in, as opposed to creating individual experiences at home where the gig economy responds to you. It means that you leave reviews on people's shitty Airbnbs when they treat you poorly, as opposed to corporate hotel monopolies that can treat people however they want because they get a whole bunch of money from the cities that contracted them them in the very first place, right? It also means that you're far more likely to be happier, not only as an employee, but as a consumer. We think that's far better for the economy as so far as people being happy, not only is like the purpose of how we want to like create employment in the first place, but B, it's like just better for economic productivity in the long term. Before we talk about some rebuttal and why this is necessary because of like long-term shifts in automation and outsourcing, let's go ahead and take back half.
So you say that there's no recourse when it comes to abuses of multinational corporations, yet employment law is one of the biggest branches of law that there is, and it's on the rise because there are laws preventing such abuses from happening.
That was true in a world where corporations did not own the government and the monopolies that make sure that they can be protected from those abuses, right? The status quo of where markets are going is that corporations are less susceptible to being regulated by the government because they quite literally buy the politicians that write the laws that regulate the companies in the very first place. That happens more in the status quo. You need a lot of money and a lot of political will to fight that. You're probably not going to get it. Why is this necessary to account for long-term shifts in the labor market? With things like automation and outsourcing that are pushing the labor market to a place where the only way you can get long-term employment is that if you have an education or you have some sort of technical training. That is unavailable to people in places like Midwestern states or places that are in poverty that do not have the capital to go and get an education or get that training that is necessary, which means millions of people are being shut out of the employment market, which means even though you prefer, if we assume that all of the terms of long-term employment are better on their side of the house, people don't have employment at all, which means they need the gig economy just to survive. Once they gain that capital and form those relationships with consumers in the very first place, they're often able to go to college and get an education and do the things that they say they want to do. So even if we prefer all the comparatives on their side of the house, you get long-term employment by making sure people have capital to access the markets in the very first place. Thus, we're incredibly proud to oppose.
In my speech today, I'm going to be focusing on how the gig economy is going to specifically harm the workers which participate in that economy. But before that, I need to get into a little bit of deconstruction from my opponent's case. And basically what we see here is he fails to account for the benefits of a union. In his response to the POI, he talked about how corporations can buy the government. Well, guess what? They can't buy the unions. And when the gig economy prevails, unions will not be able to solve for that harm. They also talk about worker choice and how people will be able to finally get long-term employment because of the gig economy, and that's simply not true. Basically, people are not able to choose to opt out of certain jobs. They do not have the financial capacity to do so. They don't have savings, and therefore they have to take the bad jobs, and they also are not able to save up for college because they have to regularly spend that money. In their world, they would demand that people have savings so that they would be able to refuse jobs that they don't want and to be able to, build up money. And that's simply not the truth of the world today. But now getting on to my constructive material, I'm going to focus on 3 points. First off, job security, then the progression upwards in society that we see in most traditional trades, and finally, the integrity of the profession, which is quite important and I'll get more into. But first off, job security. Basically, unions and traditional forms of employment ensure that employers are not so easily able to simply dismiss someone as the contracts which he would say that we have. Historically, unions have fought to keep jobs, and that prevents easy dismissal. They try to hand wave it away, but quite simply, it is much more difficult for an employer in a union-based firm to get rid of someone. We see this in all kinds of areas, like factory jobs and education. People are not laid off to the same degree as they would be if they solely were forced to care about profits, because then they would have to suffer from things like strikes. Basically, people need dependable employment. It brings peace of mind. It allows them to plan for the future when a union is there to protect them from a predatory employer. With a gig economy, they can be dismissed without having anyone to fight for them. So the kinds of dismissals which he fears so much are only going to increase, and people will never be able to plan their lives according to the job that they have. Sure, go ahead.
All of this was probably true in a world where unions were actually powerful. They are on the decline thanks to governors like Scott Walker and lots of individual legislation. Given the fact that unions don't have the power of collective bargaining to the degree that they used to, at least give people the choice to get employed in the first place and get some money.
Okay, yes, unions are on the decline, but we want to counteract that, and the gig economy is part of the reason they are on decline, because when someone can just go outside and get some other worker to replace a union worker, then the unions become less powerful. So the gig economy could actually theoretically make this worse. What we want, no thank you, is a powerful union which is actually able to operate through collective bargaining, and my entire point here is that the gig economy does not allow for collective bargaining. Also, the gig economy is more susceptible to downturns in the economy. Basically, when there's a well-established company, they have savings, they have assets that allow them to keep on workers for when the economy goes back up. But right now, the gig economy is only operational, functionally operational when people are actively buying that product, because they don't have large amounts of assets to carry them through the downturns, and so they will, so the workers will be hurt there in not getting employed when there's, not keeping a job when there's slightly less economic incentive. But then on to career progression. Basically what we see here is traditionally, when people work longer, they get higher pay and they get different kinds of jobs through promotion processes. So basically, people should expect to see a certain amount of pay increase throughout their lives. It accounts for things like inflation and you know, just more experience should deserve higher pay. But with the gig economy, because there's always more direct competition, people cannot expect that. Also, since in the gig economy you're only competing for stars and not promotions, you cannot expect the nature of your work to change. And as you age, as your body changes, you need to have that progression. You need to eventually transition to a desk job, and not having experience appropriate, like a lot of employers will not count a gig economy job as true experience, will not allow you to progress forward. Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, but Robert told you about how many people use their gig economy jobs to transition into markets either through paying for education or just getting a full-time long-term job in the long run. Why do those jobs no longer exist alongside a gig economy?
Because, like I said before, when people are working in the gig economy, they are working to survive, not to save up for education. They often won't, most people in those jobs, Uber does not pay enough for someone to save up to go to college. It's just not enough money because they can't bargain for increased pay. Also, people will not see a job like Uber as deserving of any kind of work experience. Gig economies do not give you the same type of experience qualifications, so you will not be able to progress towards a better profession in the future. No, thank you. So finally, I'd like to get into my last point about the integrity of the profession. So basically, when there is a well-recognized profession, people are willing to pay more for those services. They're more trusting of the people who operate there. But because we introduce the gig economy, people are less trusting of the people who work in that field. Basically, an employer carries with it a certain degree of name recognition, which ensures that people are getting what they ask for. With the gig economy, consumer confidence will inevitably go down because they don't know who is on the other side of that app. All they have is a star rating and no other basis, and that is not sufficient to make good choices when you're dealing with your checkbook, really. People are not going to trust the gig economy as well, but convenience will dictate that it continues to exist, and that means that people will get lower quality products and services. That means that people will not be able to trust the things that they buy as effectively, and that is a major harm to all of those people who, while they don't have the same convenience, would prefer to, who are actually well qualified and therefore be better, more effective at serving the consumer.
Here.
I I really like the unions in the fantasy world that opening government proposes, but the reality is unions in the real world are either corrupted by corporations, destroyed by those corporations, or are so large that they actually have no interest in giving leverage to single employees that might have problems with the corporation. And HR departments exist for the sole ability to protect the liability of the company and not for the employee. The dream world where employees have any kind of safety in full-time, long-term employment is going away, and we think that we'd rather an economy where both exist, full-time, long-term employment, and a gig economy, to give the most autonomy to the workers possible. Two things in this speech. Firstly, I'd like to push back, give you a little bit of unique argumentation about how full-time, long-term jobs still exist on our side of the house alongside gig economy employment, and why that unique relationship will make it better for employees altogether. And then secondly, I want to talk about employees doing mostly comparative analysis between what Robert gave you and what the opening government gave you. Okay, 3 reasons that full-time, long-term employment still exists on our side of the house. The first reason is that companies still have incentives to have full-time, long-term employees because they don't want their employees to go to their competitors and give their competitors their trade secrets, right? So there's a reason that Google wants some of their employees to just be Google employees, because if they had all gig economy employees, all those employees could have a gig at Google, then go to Microsoft and share those secrets. It would be far harder to be competitive if you didn't have those kinds of unique employees, right? But the second reason is they want to train and integrate employees. I think the Prime Minister gives you this argumentation. The reason that full-time, long-term employment exists is because in some industries it's just better to have an employee for 3 years because there's increasing returns upon having that employee, right? But thirdly, we think that full-time, long-term employees establish a culture of training for other new employees that come in, right? So a company wants to have 10 employees that have been there for a long time that can train new employees when those employees get integrated, right? So we think in a lot of industries, like high-level industries like law, engineering, tech, there's still going to be full-time, long-term employment, right? We think it's going to exist alongside a gig economy. We see a world where Google, for instance, has their own full-time set of employees, but then when they need a little bit of extra manpower, they go and get gig economy programmers that have good portfolios to make sure that they can push their next product forward, right? What does this reality look like then? No, thank you, not right now. We think the gig economy exists for a la carte services that help individuals transition into full-time, long-term employment in the long run, right? The only answer we get from the Deputy Prime Minister is that gig economy jobs simply do not give you enough money or experience to access full-time, long-term employment, right? We disagree with this, right? We understand that it's largely going to be circumstantial. Some individuals are never going to be able to access education in our world, unfortunately, but we think for some individuals it can make a big difference. If you take out student loans to go to university and you do Uber like on the side, you can actually make money that allows you to eat or be able to be more productive at university. And the good thing about the gig economy is you can decide how much you want to work and ensure that you're not doing Uber drives on finals week and doing Uber drives more during the beginning of the semester. That kind of leverage and autonomy is something that you don't get on their side of the house. Okay, onto employees and comparative. I'll take you a PY from opening within this analysis, right? A couple things that opening government gives us. One, they tell us that a gig economy is a David versus Goliath scenario. 2 responses to this. The first is the response I gave in the POI, that most gig economy gigs are not this kind of business versus individual transaction. We're talking about Airbnb and Uber, where individuals are honestly like going against the same people. There's people in the same socioeconomic status as them, not individuals that are like willing to take people to court with large pieces of litigation, right? But the second thing is we actually think in a world where a business is hiring out to a gig economy, it might actually be better for the employee if they're a gig economy than they're full-time. Because if that is actually an exploitative business that wants to harm them, then they can just say, when the gig's over, okay, I'll go to your competitor, or I'll go do something else. The good thing is they don't have they're not struck to these very long-term contracts that makes it feel like they're coerced to stay with that business for a long period of time, right? We think we want to push back against opening government's characterization that the businesses don't want these people. We think the gig economy exists because real demand exists, and the businesses want these people, and it's not just they're sucking them in to coerce them in the long run. Okay, what was opening government's like biggest piece of analysis? And that is gig economy jobs don't come with HR departments and unions, right? First piece of response to this. HR departments don't exist to like help employees. They exist to protect companies from liability with employees. They exist to find ways to make sure there's at-will employment so they can fire that employee at any time. The kind of protections that they want are literally being fought back by the own mechanism that they talked about, right? But second thing's about unions, right? Honestly, the Deputy Prime Minister is wrong. Unions do get bought out for corporations. There's many cases where corporations quite literally pay money to union leadership to not be a hassle to them. There's other circumstances in countries without like firm law enforcement, like Colombia, where Coca-Cola quite literally assassinates leaders of unions, right? We don't think unions have any ability to actually become powerful in an economy where, like Robert told you, businesses have an incredible amount of leverage over political decision making because of their massive amounts of money. I'll take the Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay, but just 1 year ago, teachers were on a strike, and they got much more resources for their classrooms because of that strike. So unions are at least somewhat effective, especially here in America, where they can't assassinate people.
Okay, two things. One, teachers can strike without a union, right? Oftentimes, unions actually make it harder for them to do this because they're paying dues to this union, and union leadership has an incentive to say, don't strike because that's not it's not a good time to do that, and they don't want that because they're in cushy jobs because they're union leaders, right? But secondly, we think, honestly, gig economy individuals could strike too. If Uber was starting to be a lot more crappy than Lyft, for instance, all those Uber employees could move to Lyft, and that could create open market leverage to make Uber kind of shift their prices, right? So those same kind of mechanisms exist in a gig economy. They just don't exist with the same kind of coercive forces that exist in a full-time, long-term employment situation, right? Robert told you that that's the analysis. What the analysis that Robert gave you, on the other hand, is about how corporations have this political leverage that makes it impossible for employees to actually get the leg up, right? So what do we say is the mechanism on our side of the house? The mechanism is not necessarily the gig economy is the best thing ever, but the mechanism is autonomy for workers to be able to actualize their interests, whatever those may be at a certain period of time, right? So if the employee has the interest of only working 4 hours a week, a gig economy gives them access to be able to make that kind of interest happen, right? So what does this mean, right? Well, this means that we live in a world where an employer can decide when it is that they're ready to enter full-time employment. We live in a world where employees can decide whether or not they want to work that day. They live in the world where they can decide which markets they want to access, right? We think when we get that kind of employment autonomy, we get a lot of the benefits that Robert talked about. Not only do we have employees that are far happier with their jobs and far more likely to want to get up and go to work whatever they're doing at night during the day, but we also get a market that actually responds to consumer demand, right? McDonald's never wanted to have delivery beforehand, even though there was tons of demand. We think we get in a world where there is such a thing as Uber Eats. When that demand exists, the gig economy has the autonomy and flexibility to make sure that that kind of consumer demand is answered. We think it's a far better world than our side of the house.
Thank you, Deputy, for your proposition, and I welcome the member from here.
Let's reframe this argument, because we believe that the government did not provide a weighing mechanism nor definitions for today's debate. We want to provide the weighing mechanism today as what is most beneficial to citizens, whereas the definition of gig economy is an economic shift to gig jobs and less traditionally educated jobs and educated people that are college educated. And so to provide framework of what our world looks like with these items, we see that a gig economy supports monopolies actually in opposition to what the top op is saying. Because when you have a gig economy, you need a central business that has the influence, the advertising, the marketing power to attract so many workers that are employed by these gig jobs. We see that this leads to companies that control a marketplace, we see that this leads to people being employed by companies that control the marketplace at a larger and larger rate. For example, Amazon controls 44% of all e-commerce online, and they are on the verge of creating a monopoly. Yet, antitrust law is unfortunately not protecting people from this. So we see that actually the gig economy supports monopolies, and we see 3 reasons why this is net bad. First, this harms the environment. Second, this leads to an uneducated population. And third, this wipes out small businesses while supporting monopolies. But first, we're going to take that now.
Okay, so my question for you is how is your description of a gig economy business any different than existing large-scale corporations like Coca-Cola or Best Buy or whatever?
Here, here.
It's a lot different because we see that in the status quo, those companies, their employees have legal recourse through employment law lawsuits, and we also see that they have HRs and unions to protect people from those items. Whereas Uber, for example, does not have an HR department, and we see several harms that come into this, so I'm going to go into my reputation now. We see the op saying that the gig economy can exist alongside full-time jobs, and we don't disagree. However, the resolution states that there must be a shift towards a gig economy, and we still get the harms of gig jobs. This means we see that when all of our economy shifts to that focus, that is net detrimental for reasons that I'll be going into later. We see that in refutation to the point that long-term contracts are bad or harmful, many jobs in the status quo where you're employed by big businesses have you sign contracts in the first place. We also believe that contracts provide a stability for their workers. Also, they say that HR does not help employees. However, there are hundreds of people all across the United States that file employment lawsuits and get settlements that actually help them have justice and redistribute it back to them. Now, let's go into my points of positive matter. How does this harm the environment? We see that the top 100 companies account for 70% of the pollution that is out there. So we see that people are less likely to fight for climate change because in gig economies, most of the people will be working for the largest perpetrators like Uber, like Amazon, like Limebike, and more. So we see that these top 100 companies often employ gig workers, and this supports net detrimental effects to the environment. And we see that this has negative impacts for all of the population of the globe. We see that environmental change creates environmental refugees, and particularly in sub-Saharan areas and other areas that are dependent on agriculture. We see that this harms food production and endangers all lives, as we are only given 12 years left, according to a study that says that there will be irreversible damage to our environment within 12 years. Moving on to my second point, we see that this leads to an uneducated population. Now, they say that having gig employments means that you're going to be saving up money for college. However, this is not true, as the psychological research shows that people who are out of high school for longer end up having less incentive to go back to college. So we see that you're not actually saving up. Instead, you're just learning how to survive in the world without without a college education, and you're less likely to go to college in the first place. This means that people are going to be uneducated, and we need that educated population so we can have an educated democracy, and we have educated voters to put good people into office. We see that the U.S. is falling behind in education in comparison to other first world nations like China, like France, like UK. We see that this leads to a decline in technological advancement, and we see that this puts America at a lowering rate of control and autonomy. We see that this is going to harm America in the long term because it is going to lead to a lack of education, which means a lack of innovation, which means a lack of business. Now, moving on to my last and final point, we see this wipes out small businesses by supporting monopolies instead. This is because only the corporations that are large enough have the ability to support gig employers. And this leads to a hyper-competitive, multinational corporation-controlled environment where, for example, Uber, they own Lime bikes, they own Lime scooters, they own Uber Eats, they own all of these things, and they are a huge multinational corporation, and that's why they're able to provide a gig economy jobs. We see that with the rise of monopolies, this means that they're going to raise prices for the consumer. For example, Amazon. I am a freelance worker on Amazon, and I have my own business on it. And they have exponentially increased the prices to a point where they take 60% of my profit online as an e-commerce trader. And they have complete control of the resources, and they raise the prices for all. We see that this is net detrimental because it prevents small businesses from being able to start up. Because when prices are raised, that means that there are less access to supplies that people can have to start those businesses in the first place. We see that the control of resources makes it more difficult for people to begin their businesses, and the raise in prices hurts everyone that has to buy things that they need to survive. We see that in this world, monopolies are going to take first place. And we see that this is going to be net detrimental to everyone globally because of the environment, particularly to people that are starting small businesses, and is going to lead to an uneducated voting population, which is going to have detrimental impacts for our government. Also, to extend one point from the other side, we see that when there's no HR department, this means that sexual assault is more likely to happen. As we see in Uber and Airbnb, where there's no recourse because people are unsupervised and can't launch any complaints with HR. Thank you.
Okay, what we saw was an OG that fundamentally failed to understand when and where and why unions and organized labor died. And we saw a CG that failed to grasp that Uber and Airbnb were not the first large-scale multinational corporation. Neither Gov side engaged with the world that would exist without a market economy. We want to be a team that do so, okay? We think that we need to engage in a world where like low-skill jobs are being outsourced or replaced by automation. We need to engage in a world where there are right-to-work laws, right? Like Maggie Thatcher killed the unions in the UK in the 1980s, and she didn't use Uber to do it. But secondly, I want to talk to you about the importance, so this is where we like have a unique extension. I want to talk to you about the importance of a gig economy in the areas that have been left behind, or in the case of the developed world, never found in the first place. We think that in an increasingly globalized and increasingly technologically connected world, a gig economy means that all you need to access a market and access a labor market is an internet connection. We think that's incredibly new for those communities. No, thank you. First, rebuttal. Okay. We think this idea of labor has been consistently well dealt with. On your side of the house, there isn't a world where unions exist because unions were destroyed and like dismembered and like made impotent long before the gig economy. In fact, we think the gig economy is in fact a response to the growing world where like organized labor was less successful. We think you have a time-lag problem in your case. None of your analysis works. Okay. Next, power dynamics and company firms. Right, we get told that because you're contractors, you can't negotiate with your company. We think what's important, though, is that what a gig economy does provide, no thank you, and this will be a lot of the crux of our analysis, no thank you, is that means you can sit down, is that you have more labor mobility in society, right? We think that what happens is when in a gig society where you have the ability to get more jobs more easily, to change different jobs, you actually have more power, negotiating power as a worker than you do in a world where you are tied to a large corporation where there is no transition, where there is poor labor mobility. So if you piss off that corporation or you piss off your union or whatever, you are out of work and you're unlikely to find a new one soon. We think that's problematic. Okay, low quality of life for workers. This isn't contingent on the fact, it doesn't deal with the areas in the developing world or the forgotten areas in the developed worlds where there is no economy left in the first place. We think that a gig economy is the only way that they can access quality of life in the first place. But two, we think that the vast increases to the quality of life of consumers needs to be weighed adequately in this round. Uber is incredibly useful, right? And we think we need to balance that. Obviously I'm from BC, so I know what a world without Uber is like, and it sucks. Okay? We think that consumer quality needs to be balanced in this round with right to workers. We think we win both. So, all right. A response to the extension, yeah, I'll take back half.
So just because we have, the definition of the gig economy means that we're going to shift to a gig economy. So it doesn't mean that the gig economy is going to be gone. It means that it's going to be not the main source of all the jobs for people in America.
Okay, regret implies that you regret the world that exists. The world that exists is one where a gig economy is prevalent, but not the entirety of the labor force. We think, oh, dealt with that. Also, just common logic dealt with that. No, thank you. Okay, gig economies, you actually get more monopolies, right? Like Brendan asks a POI, which I think is very substantial, is never responded to, which is like, how is this different than all the major corporations that existed before? No, thank you. The only response we get is like, well, they have HR departments. Well, that's great, except you're beholden to those corporations and there's not labor mobility in a way that exists previously. Okay, we think you also get like no analysis as to why these gig economies have like better or have monopolies more, because you're also dealing with industries like, especially in the tech industry, where you have a very quick moving market with like a low time scale. So we think you actually see like less companies that have established huge monopolies for large scale than you do in like the previous labor market where Coca-Cola and Pepsi have had like a monopoly for 100 years. You don't see that in the tech economy as of yet. Next, we get this like, it's bad for the environment, because here's the thing, the 100 biggest companies employ a whole bunch of people, and then those people are pro-pollution. Well, here's the thing about the 100 biggest companies, is whether they're gig economies or not gig economies, they still employ a lot of people. That's what makes them the 100 biggest companies. No, thank you, you still get the pollution. 2, hurt small business. This point's entirely contingent on their monopoly analysis, which was, well, the analysis was non-existent. That point falls. Okay, extension. I want to engage about the importance of a gig economy to those areas left behind. Or, as I said, never found. We think in a world without a gig economy, the world that they would prefer, we think when there is no industry in your community, whether you're in a forgotten area of the developed world, whether you're in the developing world, you have one option. That option is to move, okay? 2 things. 1, we think even if you take this option in the world with a gig economy, because there's more labor mobility, because there's more companies and there's easier access into those companies, if you do choose to move and drive an Uber, it's a lot easier than, say, moving to the big city and trying to get a job as a taxi driver. That's important. But second, we think that a lot of people are hesitant to move in the first place. And that's why people continue to stay in these dying communities, right? Like these rural communities, we think they want to stay where they believe that like God is above and their fathers are below. We think that's important to them, right? We think that what a gig economy provides is access to the labor market as long as you have an internet connection, which did not exist before, right? You can be work as a contractor online and stay in the communities that you have lived in hundreds of years, right? Moreover, in the developing world, we think that it's easier. You don't have to wait for industry to move to your area. All you need is an internet connection, and you can access that labor market. That's incredibly important. Second part of our extension, in a world like this, okay, the most important thing in a recession is access to labor mobility. That is huge, right? We get this idea that gig economies are worse in a recession. Absolutely false. Gig economies are the best possible thing in a recession. Because if the world they prefer exists where you are tied to a corporation, guess what? In a bad recession, that corporation is going to fail entirely, or it's going to have massive layoffs and cuts. And you have tied yourself to the mast of the ship that is now sunk, and you're left adrift, right? In a gig economy, because there's labor mobility, you can move around. Moreover, in countries where there's institutional systems that cause poor labor mobility in the first place, countries like France, countries like India, where it's very hard to get a job, it's very hard to fire people, the government has to approve all of those things. The introduction of gig economies allows people to circumvent those rules and allow people to become contractors much easier. So you think people in India before were very hesitant to move because there's no guarantee that they could get another job. Now they can because there's a gig economy, so they can always access labor. It gives them increased labor mobility. You get better consumer benefits. You get better employee benefits because you can actually have a job where you can get supplementary income. We think that's incredibly important. Ladies and gentlemen, so proud to oppose.
We as government see substantial problems in the status quo that are directly attributed to a gig economy. So looking at the benefit to American citizens, we're going to be going over 3 questions that kind of overview the main points of conflict that we've been going back and forth on in this debate. So the 3 questions are going to be, how does HR and company protection through unions really affect citizens? What is going to be benefiting workers on each side? And then lastly, what does this shift, because that's really what we're looking at, this fundamental change in our economy, what does this shift mean for our world? So first, going into how HR and company protection through unions are affecting these people, we can see with the massive allegations against Uber and Airbnb with sexual assault and problems with these freelancers, we can see that with all this rape and all these actual inequalities that are happening and being reported, and how there's no oversight because there's no HR. This is directly from the gig economy, because when you have this structure, of a company or these multinational corporations that can't be directly overseeing and controlling the transactions that are going on, you see a shift that is more dangerous for individuals and way more problematic. I'll take that, Kat, yes.
Okay, in a gig economy where you have labor mobility, if you are, let's say, like sexually harassed by your boss or you're mistreated by your corporation, you can move because you have access to another job. In the world that you have, you are tied to that corporation and there's not access to more jobs, so you're less likely to report when your boss sexually harasses you. You're more likely to be exploited.
I see this as super problematic. I don't think people should be having to move and change what they're doing because they're being assaulted or raped. I don't really want to bring that into this debate. I think we should focus on trying to prevent this, because if someone knows that we're going to be having an HR directly looking over them and actually patrolling them and being able to file charges and remove these people from the jobs and have real punishment, as opposed to when it's actually a patron of the company, I think that's completely different. Not right now. So looking into this, we can also see the changes with unions and how it's really, the opposition tries to claim that these unions are corrupt and that they're being swayed and that they're not as effective, but we can see that a union is not going to be protecting individuals as well as a multinational corporation is. These unions are obviously going to be acting in interest of the workers as opposed to these giant companies. So I'm going to be moving into the second question about what is benefiting these workers overall. So it's brought in this debate, the first, the stability of jobs, and second, education. So one thing that was a huge contradiction on the side of the opposition, they discuss how it's so easy to be an Uber driver, for example, as a student. However, then they go back and claim that corporations and monopolies are not actually on the rise from corporations and how it's not these giant companies that are like being benefited from the gig corporation. But we see if it's so easy to be an Uber driver, it's so easy to participate in this, how is it not going to be growing and taking jobs away from the larger other jobs? So we're seeing that this actual shift is causing that these monopolies and these corporations are the ones that are profiting and gaining and having more jobs moved toward them. So we can see this, that we're losing the stability, we're losing the contracts that are going to ensure wealth and prosper and continual growth, as it's really easy when you have someone else setting your wages and choosing what's happening for you. It's not going to be as beneficial for the worker. And also we can see with education, we talked about the statistical proof and evidence that the longer that you're out of high school, the less likely you are to go back and invest in your higher education. So we can see that the longer that you're encouraged to stay out of high school, being an Uber driver and Airbnb, the less likely you are to actually go back and invest. So this is pretty clear that education, higher education is not going to be increased, is not going to be assisted. In fact, it's going to be a direct detriment. So now moving into the last question, which I really think is the main point in this debate, is what does this actual shift, which is what we're looking at today, what does it mean for our world? So I'm going to be talking about the difference between small businesses and corporations, and that's difference. Then we're going to be going into monopolies, and lastly about environmental harm, because I really think that's where like the big meat of this debate is. So first, talking about small businesses and corporations, I think it's pretty clear that a small business isn't going to be paying someone as a Instagram influencer. They're not going to be able to do the same kind of processes that Uber does with all of its subdivisions. We can see that it's really these monopolies and giant multinational corporations that are having the biggest growth from this gig economy, which is extremely harmful to our economic structure, especially because small businesses are really the backbone of America. Sure, I'll take your question.
So let's assume Uber becomes the corporate behemoth you say it will. If it becomes that big, they become susceptible to the same sorts of regulations that offer employment protections and these things that you champion on your side of the house. Which means the only difference between our sides of the debate is that I get to stay in my pajamas while Pizza Hut brings me food. Why is that any comparatively worse for you?
I completely disagree, because the current trust laws and the regulations that we have are not going to be regulating Uber like you claim they will. We think this is completely evident and clear because multinational corporations currently aren't held to the right standards that they should be, especially because Uber, this company that is growing so big, it's not going to have the HR, it's not going to have the company protection. You claim that there's no real difference between our world, but I have just pointed out giant splits, especially because Uber as this national corporation as opposed to small businesses that are going to have different standards and that are not going to be able to abuse their workers and are not going to be as problematic for consumers. It's going to be a huge difference and divide between those two worlds. Also, it was brought up by the bottom opposition that just as monopolies existed before a gig economy, that this wasn't a rise, but we can clearly see from what I've brought up how it's changing. We're progressing towards more and more huge corporations controlling our country. It's a huge current event, hot button topic today that our world is becoming more globalized, and there's these huge corporations that are taking over and being challenging, and we can directly see this shift as coming from that point in probably around the 70s or 80s of where we're moving away from the small business, local America into these giant multinational corporations. So we see that this shift is what's causing all of these problems. problems going into our environmental harm. The fact that the top 100 corporations in the world are accountable for 70% of the pollution, why would we want to support this or increase this? If we see a way that we can help decrease monopolies, which would be preventing the rise of the gig economy, preventing these national multi-corporations, then we really have the burden to see that we regret this, to see that this is what has caused harm and this is what is moving towards harm. So overall, what we can see in this debate, first we talked about HR and company protection. When we're looking at the average American, how is it going to be beneficial to not have a safe, supportive work environment that is even at all healthy to live in? We can also see what's benefiting workers with the stability of jobs and education. What plan and what world is actually going to allow for people to have education? If we're having these freelance jobs that are not supporting people and pushing them in the direction to have their education, how are we going to have a more educated voter population? How are we going to have a better America? And then lastly, we looked about what this shift means for our world. Talked about small businesses and corporations. Obviously, if we did not have the shift, we would have more small businesses in a more localized community that wouldn't be under the thumb and under the will of these multinational corporations. We talked about how monopolies are completely on the rise, and we talked about this environmental harm that is really, really ruining our world and something that we immediately need to change, and in this case, regret. So for these reasons, we stand firmly that this House regrets the rise of the gig economy. Thank you.
Further remarks, and we'll open the closing opposition with.
It is clear that closing opposition has won the debate because we're the ones who are focusing on communities and the development, because that is all that has really mattered in the debate. Because development and communities are where the workers reside and where the impact of businesses go. Furthermore, we have not heard anything on closing government as to how they will have development, where they have simply stated that the existing framework of what a large corporation is will be adding to that. But that does not change anything about the world. It doesn't benefit any workers if we just acknowledge, oh yeah, there's pollution on their side of the debate. So first of all, let's analyze their 3 points and just discuss why they're completely irrelevant. And then we'll weigh workers, communities, and development. So first, they say that the environment, the large corporations contribute about 70% of the pollution. Okay, fine. But if this already happens, if this is just what large corporations, like how this has occurred in the world, we live in reality on our side of the house in closing opposition. So we don't believe that adding to corporations will in fact increase pollution. It's just, if you just like the idea of growth and capitalism, like we can't really argue that on our side of the house. Number two, we say on the as far as your undereducated workforce goes, we're saying 2 things. That we have won because number one, that like education has gone down and we're moving towards a service-based economy, right? So the bachelor's degree just simply doesn't have the value that it used to. You can't go out of college and then all of a sudden have a job. It's just not how it works. And then number two, undereducated and unskilled labor that are already being displaced by the automation, like those people have an outlet where they can use those jobs. Yes?
Yeah, so how does this hypermobility of labor that your partners talk about not immediately enter into a race to the bottom in terms of wages, in terms of on-the-job education, and in terms of on-the-job protections, right? Won't companies use this as they naturally do to find the lowest, cheapest goods?
Yeah, that's literally how capitalism works. The corporation always wants the lowest. But we're saying that since unions have already been on their way out since the 1980s, as Reese alluded to, we're saying that unions haven't prevented, in Oshawa, Ontario last week, GM literally just pulled out hundreds of jobs. It's not connected at all. And we're saying that unions already become so ineffective, it's not even really part of the debate anymore. But anyway, so the uneducated workforce point doesn't make sense either, because we're having these service-based jobs, and because that there's already people that are going to be displaced, like taxi drivers, if they have an outlet for a job where they have some form of income, closing opposition believes that we've won the point. So that's why that point falls. Number 3, Uber has had so many, they say that small businesses are hurt because Uber has expanded its assets. But if you look at a corporation like Bayer that has literally gone from aspirin to Monsanto, and recently has bought Monsanto, you see that diversifying businesses is just part of how large corporations work. So small businesses are inherently going to be displaced, but since we're going to be having this service-based economy with more individualized contractors, we believe that having the gig economy, having an access point for these people is important. So let's look at the 3 points that we have won on closing government. Closing opposition, sorry. So, number one, workers. We have made the point of labor mobility that has not been discussed at all on the closing government side. Because we have said that people have the ability to move, and because that is humanity's oldest form of poverty mitigation. Because if people have the ability to move and have freedom of access between jobs and choose their own hours, we believe we've won that point, because it overshadows the point that closing government has made regarding the ability of people to have job training, because labor mobility it's how the economy is working now, and it's going to continue to do so, because we acknowledge the trends of how the economy has been growing on our side of the house, and we have said that people have the ability to move out of areas that have no development on our side of the house as well. So that's how we have won the workers' point, because workers gain more, since they gain more labor mobility, and because service jobs are going to be the future of the economy, it just makes sense that closing opposition has won this point. Number two, communities. So we're saying that rural areas or areas with little development have a lack of jobs overall, and that we do not want people to simply think their only option is to do the job that their father or grandfather did. Because service jobs are all that are available in most places, like in rural Maine, for example. So unless you want to commute 2 hours to a city to get a lower paid job, then in these abilities for rural places like Maine or Alaska or wherever, then you have the ability to work at your house, in your community. And that's what Reese was talking about keeping people's jobs and influence in the community. Because we don't want a brain drain in rural areas. That's just not how it works. So we're saying that on our side of the house, and this is something that closing government has not alluded to at all, is that communities are benefited by the gig economy because of the retaining of employment, and how these people can simply work from your house in the middle of nowhere, or rent your Airbnb or whatever. That keeps money in the community instead of displacing it and making these people move to larger areas simply for the idea of more income or opportunities. Because these opportunities do not exist in the current status of the economy. And lastly, we've chosen to, we won the point of development, because we add to the existing framework of the economy as well, because we've stated that unions are ineffective, and since we just talked about how GM keeps pulling more jobs out of North America, it's nothing to do with the fact of the gig economy. It's the idea that unions have become ineffective for 30 years, the increasing of right-to-work laws around the United States, where people do not pay into union coffers anymore, and they have the ability to just work without being part of the union. They have already lost their value completely, and that's why we're saying that in terms of development, the gig economy is going to be the way of the future. And we want small business in our side of the house as well, but we do acknowledge the fact that large corporations are the bedrock of the economy, and that is going to be the continuation. So we do not buy the fact that Uber or Lyft or Airbnb is becoming a large corporation as a reason not to support them. We're saying, so if you look over our analysis, number one, we have stated that workers gain more rights and abilities in terms of labor mobility as a result of the gig economy. Number two, communities retain talent and income that would otherwise be displaced. And number three, the development that occurs with the gig economy is in tangent with current economic trends and will continue to do so. So we want people to have the ability to pick their own hours and do whatever they want in their free time. So that's why closing opposition has won the round, and why the economy will continue to grow for the interim. Thank you.